Good morning. Today I will present to you the story of Somali resettlement and integration. I had the opportunity to deliver a similar presentation on the same topic at the Metropolis Conference in March of this year. So I know some of you were there, so please bear with me. But I believe there's a lot to learn from this story, and I will try my best to present the main points within the time that I have. First, setting the context. Since the mid-80s, 1980s, thousands of Somalis have come to Canada fleeing human rights abuses by the regime of Mohammed Syed Barre and the civil war that ensued following the downfall of the regime in 1991. A fifth of the Somali population was thought to have left Somalia and sought refuge in other countries by 1990. According to one estimate, about 55,000 Somalis arrived in Canada just between 1988 and 1996. Others put the figure at closer to 70,000. Somalia still has no stable government to this day and has been considered as the most fragile state in the world for 6 years in a row, only to be overtaken by South Sudan a couple of years ago. When Somali refugees arrived in the 1980s, there was no established Somali community waiting for them in Canada. In the first decade of Somali resettlement, Somali refugees therefore had a very difficult experience settling here in our country. Those who arrived after 2002 fared relatively better in terms of socioeconomic outcomes compared to the first cohort, showing the benefits of having existing social networks. The differential treatment of Somali refugees. Canada has a proud resettlement history, and the people of Canada are the only recipients of the UNHCR's Nansen Award to have received it as a nation for their contribution to the causes of refugees inside Canada and abroad. And you just heard John speak very proudly of our 500 years of welcoming or entering the circle, as he talked about it. However, Canadians were ill-prepared to receive Somalis, in contrast to refugees from the 1979-80 Indo-Chinese crisis. While refugees from Indochina were welcomed and adequately supported by the federal government and various church and community groups, Somali refugees were not accorded the same welcome and resettlement support. Most Somalis entered Canada as refugee claimants and through family reunification. Somalis constituted only 2% of government-assisted refugee landings from 1993 to 2001, and about 4% from 2002 to 2009. Refugee claims from Somalis had high rates of acceptance at the Immigration and Refugee Board, generally above 90% during the early 90s. Afterwards, the acceptance rates dropped gradually to recent rates of 57% as of the period January to June of last year, 2015. An amendment to the Immigration Act, Bill C-86, was introduced in 1993 that affected particularly Somali and Afghan refugees. All applicants, including refugees, were required to have passports or satisfactory IDs in order to be granted landing or permanent resident status, as specified in Section 46.048 of the former Immigration Act. According to the then government, the purpose of this amendment was to discourage refugee claimants from destroying their travel documents and thus combat immigration fraud. However, many Somali Convention refugees approved by the Immigration and Refugee Board were unable to obtain permanent residence status as a direct result of this amendment. In the absence of a central government in Somalia following the collapse of the previous regime in 1991, there was no authority to issue or renew passports and valid identity documents in Somalia. This lack of documentation kept Somalis in Canada in limbo status. Afghan refugees were similarly affected. In 1996, Citizenship and Immigration Canada officials estimated that 7,500 convention refugees, or 90% who were Somalis, were unable to get landed permanent residence. This number of people in limbo increased to 13,000 by 1999. Convention refugees affected by the amendments were not allowed to reunite with family members who were abroad, access federal and provincial student loan and bus bursaries for colleges and university, be eligible for certain types of employment, or re-enter Canada if they left. The Undocumented Convention Refugees in Canada class was introduced in 1997 in order to accommodate those who did not have identity documents and were thus in a limbo. However, yet another set of barriers was imposed on this class. A mandatory waiting period of 5 years was introduced to obtain permanent residence after a positive decision by the IRB. The issue of identity documents was resolved in 2000 after the government agreed to the settlement of a charter challenge which was launched 4 years earlier by a group of Somali refugees. As a result of the settlement, affidavits from individuals or from credible Somali organizations in Canada were accepted in order to attest to the identity of Somali refugees. The new Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, issued in 2002, contained the terms of the settlement, and the Undocumented Convention Refugees in Canada class was abolished. But other challenges, steeped in racial stereotypes, remain to this day. Documents that Somalis present to establish family relationships are often not accepted, so they are still required to undergo DNA tests when applying for family reunification. This creates delays and increases costs for family reunification. Other than government policies, the media also promoted negative images of Somali refugees. They were assumed to be an economic burden on the social welfare system of Canada, and following the 9/11 attacks in the US, they were increasingly seen as a security threat to Canadians due to their faith. These issues contributed to the hostile environment with which Somali refugees had to contend in the process of settlement and integration. It should therefore come as no surprise that the Somali community experienced a range of negative socioeconomic outcomes. Some settlement difficulties. Upon their arrival in Canada, Somali refugees faced a number of settlement difficulties that persisted for 2 decades. In the area of language, in general, most Somalis spoke neither English or French when they arrived. Language barriers were not only a big challenge for settlement and integration into Canadian society, but they also created delays in the refugee determination process owing to a shortage of Somali interpreters. Most settlement agencies at the time did not provide culturally appropriate Somali services in Somali language. Moreover, language barriers increased the isolation of Somali refugees, especially Somali women, as they had less access to education even before they had fled their country. Mental health. Having experienced A, violence back home, B, long waiting periods in refugee camps, and C, prolonged processing periods in Canada, Somali refugees were prone to post-traumatic stress and other mental health issues. The lack of appropriate and culturally sensitive mental health services in earlier years also increased the settlement challenges of Somali refugees. Unfortunately, and to this day, law enforcement authorities do not always know how to interact with persons with mental health issues. Couple that with racism, and the confrontation is often fatal. The case of Abdirahman Abdi, a Somali Canadian with mental health issues who unnecessarily lost his life in the hands of the Ottawa police last July, is still fresh in many of our minds. In the area of housing, finding appropriate housing was a challenge, especially as Somali families were often large. Private landlords were reluctant to rent their units to racialized refugees, most of whom were on social assistance. Many Somalis, especially those on welfare, were asked to provide co-signers with an income above $50,000, and hence were not in a position to rent from the market. They ended up living in subsidized housing, often in low-income neighborhoods where the quality of services were low. In the area of education, outcomes on education were also lower for Somalis than for other immigrant populations. According to the 2006 census data, only 13% of Somali Canadian adults had a university degree, compared with 24% of the total Canadian adult population. Much fewer Somali women, 9%, were university graduates. In terms of other education indicators, the number of Somali-speaking students who dropped out of high school in Toronto was estimated at 25%, according to a Toronto District School Board commissioned report. Higher suspension rates and lower achievements in standardized tests were also reported. Evidence showed that racialized immigrant youth face discrimination in the form of harsher punishments in schools. Even when the most resilient students manage to complete university education, they face challenges in finding employment. And so let's look at employment. In the first lost decade of waiting to get their permanent resident status, Somali refugees only had temporary work permits, which presented another set of barriers to employment, as employers preferred candidates who were seen to be permanent residents. The fact that racialized immigrants and refugees generally have fewer opportunities in accessing non-precarious full-time employment has been well documented. The Somali community in Canada faced a number of barriers, including intersectional discrimination, to access non-precarious full-time employment. Women were and still are among the most vulnerable. Being Black, Muslim, and women, they face discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and gender. Somali male youth also face significant barriers, as reported in the study entitled Cashberta, which analyzed the trajectories of those who migrated to Alberta searching for employment but ended up dead. Despite their education, racialized university graduates continue to face significant barriers, as demonstrated by the recent case of Jama Haji Yusuf, who received a job rejection letter that cited his Somali background and a culture of resistance to authority as reasons for this rejection. This case is now awaiting the decision of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. In terms of unemployment, the 2006 census data show that the unemployment rate for adult Somali Canadians in general was 3 times higher the rate of the total adult population. Adult Somali women had a much higher unemployment rate. Moreover, 57% of Somali Canadians lived below the low-income cutoff in 2005, compared to just 11% for the total population, making them one of the most disadvantaged groups. And it'll be interesting to see as 2016 census data starts rolling out next year if there has been any shifts. But let me also spend some time talking about triumphs. The story of Somalis is not only one of discrimination and settlement challenges, but also one of resilience. In the face of the many systemic challenges mentioned above, multiple service agencies targeting Somali communities have been established over the years. Whether these were pre-existing agencies doing outreach in Somali communities or those established by Somali community members themselves, they provided accessible settlement services for the community and created employment. Despite the funding cuts by CIC, now IRCC, of some of these ethno-community organizations in 2011, a sense of resilience prevails as many still continue to serve their communities, albeit at a much reduced capacity. Indeed, some Somali community organization leaders, such as Bashir Ahmed from the Somali Canadian Education and Rural Development Organization in Edmonton, have been recognized for his outstanding achievements and has received multiple awards. Self-help initiatives have had their fair share of success. They serve to empower local community members, and some manage to recreate the social support system from back home. And in the process, they managed to bring some important policy changes that benefited other refugees and immigrants as well. As mentioned in the previous section, the government agreed to the settlement of the Charter Challenge on the Immigration Act amendments, which repealed the ID requirements that discriminated against refugee claimants from certain countries, such as Afghanistan. A group of Somali women in Toronto also launched a lawsuit against the Housing Authority in the early 90s, arguing that it discriminated against refugee claimants. The law was subsequently changed and entitled all refugee claimants to access subsidized housing in the city. More recently, in 2012, Somali parents came together to force the Toronto District School Board to improve learning outcomes for Somali-speaking children. A study was commissioned by the TDSB, and its recommendations for developing new teaching strategies and expanding homework support and mentorship programs were adopted by the board. Another crucial issue to remember is the leadership taken by the Somali community in the conversation on preventing youth radicalism. Community organizations need to be supported by government to continue this important work. In October 2015, Ahmed Hussein, a former refugee from Somalia, became the first Somali-born Canadian elected to the House of Commons. This marks another triumph for the Somali community in Canada and signals that the successful integration of Somali refugees in Canada is well underway. Some key points. Lastly, I would like to highlight the 3 key points on settlement and integration that can be derived from the Somali story. 1, the Somali community has been creating its own welcoming communities through organizations and self-help groups, and this model must be supported. Culturally appropriate services are necessary for self-empowerment, culturally appropriate services are necessary for self-empowerment. IRCC funding to the funded ethno-specific organizations should be reinstated or increased. 2, family reunification is an important element that contributes to better economic integration, and family separation can negatively affect job search and retention. For immigrants and refugees in particular, a sense of belonging can support economic integration, better health, including mental health and well-being outcomes. The racialization of poverty among people of African descent, including Somali Canadians, has been a barrier to family reunification. Many people of African descent do not meet financial eligibility requirements to sponsor their family members. IRCC should therefore reconsider the minimum income requirement for the sponsorship of parents and grandparents. DNA testing for family reunification, a routine requirement for Somali Canadians, should also be abolished. And third, racialized immigrants and refugees face multifaceted barriers in their settlement and integration process in Canada. They often experience intersections of oppression on the basis of their race, creed, gender, and other identities. Last month, the City of Toronto and OCASI, my organization, joined forces to launch a public education campaign to raise awareness about the persistence of anti-Black racism socially, politically, and economically. This is a continuation of another campaign we launched last summer to address issues of Islamophobia. A lot remains to be done in this area. Such public education activities are particularly timely in the wake of the Trump presidency in the United States, given that the xenophobic and Islamophobic rhetoric that there has the potential to resonate with some Canadians, as we are already seeing across the country. To conclude, the story of Somali resettlement and integration should not be erased from the national narrative of Canada's proud resettlement history. Instead, it is a story that must be told, retold, and documented in history in order to learn from both past successes and mistakes, and to further improve the resettlement and integration process of refugees to Canada today and in the future. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.